This bill be now read a second time. I call the member for Newtown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to speak on behalf of the Greens on the Housing Legislation Amendment Bill 2016, the bill that amends the Housing Act 2001 and the Community Housing Providers Adoption of National Law Act 2012. The amendments would provide for the New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation to enter into concurrent leases with registered community housing providers for properties owned by the corporation, effectively allowing the management of tenancies within designated public housing areas and properties to shift from government to the community sector. Due to this change, tenants will be no longer eligible for a rental rebate under the Act, but may instead be eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. This will also, the amendments create a local system of registration, monitoring and regulation of entities that provide community housing but are unable to be registered under the Community Housing Providers National Law, which must be consistent with the national scheme as far as reasonably practicable. This change was announced by the Minister for Social Housing, Brad Hazzard, as the transfer of 18,000 properties from New South Wales Housing Managed Public Housing to the community sector. The properties are found in 4 areas across the state: in Shoalhaven, North Sydney, Mid-North Coast, Hunter, New England, excluding Newcastle and the Lake Macquarie local government areas. And the process is expected to commence in 2017. There are already more than 28,000 New South Wales properties managed by some 82 community housing providers across New South Wales. Before going into detail about the areas of this bill, I wish to put it out there that this bill does nothing to increase housing stock in New South Wales. It must be made clear, especially given the comments made on the other side, that yes, there is close to 60,000 people sitting on waiting lists for public housing, and yes, this is a concern and a problem, but this bill does nothing to increase the stock and address that reduction of the waiting list. The reality is that we know that there are many issues and many challenges that tenants in public housing face. And we also know that community housing providers, many of whom are incredible organisations that provide incredible support and incredible services to community members that access community housing, are very strong and very good at what they do. We also know that there can be some challenges within the community housing sector, just as there would be in any other sector. But the reality is that the public housing sector, the public housing tenants and the issues we have with public housing are not worse in the public housing area than in the community housing area because of the fact that community housing somehow does it better. But we have to look at why. It is because for years, under successive governments in New South Wales, we have been underfunding investment in maintenance and the stock supply of public housing in this state. The other side, the government will say that it was 16 years of Labor that this government is trying to catch up on. Well, I would say that getting into close to 6 years of this bad Liberal government, we need to recognise that it is no longer an excuse to just blame the 60,000 on the other side and their 16 years. I would say, and the Greens would say, you are all to blame for this failure. The reality is that we need to see investment in public housing and the increase in public housing stock and the increase in community housing stock, not simply introducing another bill that will not address this serious issue. The Greens don't oppose this bill because we recognise that the community housing sector does do amazing work in supporting tenants that are in the need of community housing. But this is not going to solve the massive challenges we see within the housing affordability crisis and within the crisis within public housing within this state. What we need to see is a massive increased investment. We need to recognise that housing is a human right, and like education, like healthcare, like hospitals, like schools, this state should be investing as we do in public housing and not trying to require it to actually meet a situation where it is not invested in adequately, and then we wonder why it is failing and it is not working for people. Last week we saw the introduction of the Social and Affordable Housing Fund that looked to introduce 3,000 new dwellings. 59,000 applications currently for public housing in New South Wales, and we saw the addition of 3,000 new dwellings. This bill, this legislation before the House today, will actually, again, attempt to make some shift and move, but adds no additional stock and does not address those issues. And so I'd like to point out that what we need to see here is a recognition that while I hear the members on the other side saying how tough it was living in public housing, how tough it is to hear from people that are on this waiting list, the reality is that this bill does not go to solve that issue. We need serious shifts and changes, and that is not going to happen through small little increments like this. We need a massive overhaul to recognise that people will no longer be able to afford to live in our cities if we do not address the issue of public housing. Public housing has gone from something that was about people living on low incomes in our inner city areas, in our expensive areas. It is now terribly and desperately, in many cases, crisis accommodation. We know that it is the people that are of the most desperate that are able to get eligible to public housing, and we know that that puts huge pressures on those communities. But before we all bag out those communities too much, I must say that I have not seen a stronger and more resilient and more active community than those tenants living in public housing in the inner city. And I think that part of that, and the housing workers that are there and the community services that are there to support them. And so what we really need to be looking at here is this bill doing what we need to be doing? Is it addressing the problem? And the problem that we are seeing is we have 59,000 applications. That's over 100,000 people currently waiting for what we consider to be a human right, a basic right, which is access to safe, secure, affordable housing. And I know that all members in this place, because in our office, in the electorate of Newtown, while we might be put out in the Daily Telegraph as being the elite, latte, Chardonnay sipping socialists, the reality is that we have an incredible amount of public housing in our area. In Redfern, in Surrey Hills, the community at Northcote, the community around Poets Corner, and we see day to day, majority of the constituents that come to our office for help are public housing tenants that are in desperate need of assistance. And we know that while the commuting housing providers do an incredible job of providing that support, the reality is that this is not going to solve the problem. We need to see an increase in stock. I'd like to ask for a brief extension of time.
Member for Newtown seeking leave for an extension. Extension granted. Extension is granted.
Thank you. So while we're not going to see it, I would like to address some of the specifics of this bill and to seek some clarification from the Minister in reply around how it will work and how we will ensure that this is not a slippery slope of the handing over of public housing into private hands. It is very important that we recognise that government control over public housing has meant that in the past, and I'm sure all members in this place have written representations to the Minister about public housing tenants and raised concerns they have. The question needs to be asked, what will be the recourse? How will tenants within the community housing sector be able to raise concerns about the community housing providers if there are them? And I would ask that the Minister clarify that in response. The other area that I think we need to look at is what happens in relation to the Commonwealth Rent Assistance and the transfer. How will public housing tenants, and I recognise that a number of people in the sector have raised concerns about how tenants are informed about this transfer because there won't be a choice. They will be needing to transfer and they won't be given a choice. How they will be supported in the transfer of Commonwealth Rent Assistance and make sure that they don't see on paper a massive increase that causes them a whole lot of stress and anxiety when actually it won't be them to cover it. And I would seek the Minister's assurance as to how that support will be granted. I also think it's important to note and recognise that the Family and Community Services offices, the housing offices in each area, will actually be closed down in these areas. So there won't be an access point for housing for these communities to access into the government. Now that will mean that community housing providers will be better placed and will be the experts in that area to know. And so it is important for community housing providers to be given a seat at the table to make sure that they can feed in that local knowledge about what is happening in those areas and ensure that government can respond to those support services across the whole area, because there will no longer be access to a fax housing office within that area. Just on that, and while we're talking about the closure of the offices, I did want to point out that this is actually going to affect within the order of 170 to 190 staff. The PSA have raised concerns about the transfer of these houses because of the fact of these properties and the management, because of the fact that it will mean the closure of FACTS housing offices. And one thing that I would say is that there are a whole lot of services that are offered by those local FACTS housing offices that are actually more than just the direct housing support. Any member that goes to a public housing area and has that connection will recognise that they provide other supports. They are connected in with community development and other things, and it will be important to make sure that that connection with government, that connection with the government who is accountable and responsible for providing this housing, isn't lost in that mix. The other thing that I think needs to be raised and put out there is the fact that there is a real risk, and I'll go into a bit more detail around this, around the transfer of this public housing into private hands. We raised last week in this place the concerns around Serco and the fact that they haven't expressed an interest in public housing and social housing in New South Wales and in Australia. We recognise that there is nothing to prevent, there is currently nothing to prevent the private for-profit sector getting their hands on the management and running of housing in New South Wales. I recognise that there have previously been restrictions around who can tender for what. There has currently been restrictions, and there's previously been restrictions around who can tender for these in the past that have restricted it to the not-for-profit sector. We have seen now that there can be a shift to it needing to have a not-for-profit community provider, plus it can involve private providers also, so private for-profit companies also. We need to get assurances that the establishment of a local registration scheme is not an attempt to water down the access that we have, that we see to for-profit providers being able to get their dirty hands on public housing in New South Wales. If that is not the case, and if that is not the intention, then I would ask the Minister to clarify and put on the public record that there is no intention to allow Serco and other private providers access to the management of tenancies or access to the public housing and social community housing sector in this state. Because people are worried about this, there are serious concerns about this, and while it is said that the local scheme is set up to allow Aboriginal land councils and Aboriginal housing bodies to be able to engage with this scheme, which is a welcome change. If it is indeed the fact that that is the only purpose, I feel confident that the legislation or the regulations can be written such to reassure the community that are strong advocates of public housing, that want to see community housing providers and public housing providers remain with their sole purpose to serve the interests of the community in their right to housing, rather than to line their own pockets with public money for private profit. If that is not the intention, then I see no problem in the Minister ruling that out and in the regulations being very strong in making it clear that that is not an option. I would finally like to turn to the fact that we need to make sure that we are not setting ourselves up to fail if the Commonwealth Rent Assistance Scheme is cancelled. There is no requirement, there is currently no requirement for that scheme to continue, and there is a big risk that if we were to rely on providing public housing and community social housing to the people of New South Wales based solely on a funding model that sits at the behest of the Commonwealth Rent Assistance Scheme, then we may find ourselves in serious trouble down the track. That is a challenge for this government, that is a challenge for the community housing sector, and that is a challenge for all of us to make sure that we recognise that this is not just sitting on something that could fall over and that is outside of our control. In concluding, I would like to say that despite the challenges of the public housing sector, despite the challenges we see around maintenance and around waiting lists, some of the most impressive, active, engaged and community-minded people I have ever met in the electorate of Newtown live and work in public housing. We must not lose the value of public housing. We must continue to talk up the benefits of public housing, and we need to make sure that in our desire to move to a model where we talk about social housing, affordable housing, community housing, that we do not lose the inherent value in the idea of the government funding and maintaining and managing public housing. Because public housing is there to protect the interests of the vulnerable, to protect the interests of the low-income workers, so that our city can remain a place where everybody can afford to live, not just those that are uber wealthy. And that is something that we are committed to in the Greens, and that is something that I will continue to advocate for in this place, because public housing needs to be invested in and maintained.